Hi, everyone. Just so you know, we'll begin in about 4 minutes. Hi, everyone. We'll begin in about 3 minutes. Hi, everyone. We'll begin in about 2 minutes. We'll begin, everyone, in about 1 minute. Okay, everyone, let's begin. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a wonderful speaker and a very enlightening topic for our webinar today, and we'll get started in just a minute after I go over a couple of logistical items. So there's a slide presentation, and everyone should be able to see the welcome slide of the deck that's now displayed on the screen. And if not, please join via the URL that's included in the article on UCNet's homepage. We are recording this webinar, so all lines are muted. And the only video you should see is our presenters, and actually me, briefly. I will, hi. And if you forget, of course, to, as this individual did, if you forget to turn off your video, I will go ahead and step in and I will disable your video. And as far as the chat, we do want to hear from you. So please use the Zoom chat feature to submit your questions. You just simply hover your mouse along the Zoom application window and you'll see a Zoom taskbar. You open the More drop-down menu and you choose Chat. And the chat dialog box will open and you simply type in your question in the field and you hit Enter to send it. Now, speaking of questions, Dr. Bota would like to hear from you, and he will field questions both during and at the end of the presentation. So pose your questions in the chat feature, and I'll ask Dr. Bota to address them. A complete recording of this webinar, both audio and visual, will be available very shortly on the Stigma-Free UC page under the System-Wide Wellbeing page on UCNet. Okay, with our webinar house now in order, I'd like to explain a little bit about how today's session fits into the bigger picture. This webinar was created in partnership with Dr. Bota and the Stigma-Free UC initiative, which is part of UC's System-Wide Wellbeing. The System-Wide Wellbeing initiative sponsors and promotes events, programs, and resources that impact and improve UC employees' emotional, financial, physical, and nutritional well-being. In support of UC employees' emotional well-being, the Stigma-Free UC initiative was developed to foster open, positive discussions about mental health, because the first step in reducing and eliminating prejudice regarding mind disorders is to talk about them and to promote awareness around this multifaceted topic. So to that end, the Stigma-Free UC was a one-year awareness project which provided monthly programming and was focused on the elimination of mental illness discrimination through educational webinars, discussions, videos, and more. Because every human being lies somewhere on the mental illness continuum, the overarching goal is to increase our collective compassion by sharing the vast knowledge of UC experts who will help us learn about the spectrum of mind disorders and how to avoid ostracizing individuals who live with them. Over the past 12 months, the series has dispelled that polarizing concept of the other crazy person, because experts have emphasized that the continuum of mental health and illness encompasses all of us. So the initiative has been important for UC as a whole because statistics show that those who learn about mind disorders show more compassion towards those with a disorder. Our initiative's takeaway is simply to remember that mind disorders are simply part of the human condition. Let me now briefly introduce our speaker. Dr. Robert Bota is an associate clinical professor of psychiatry and human behavior at UC Irvine. His professional work focuses on the interplay between psychiatric illnesses and medical conditions, and he explores innovative ways to address the spectrum of a patient's psychosomatic needs. He has received the Physician of Excellence Award from the Orange County Medical Association for 2 years running between 2017 and current. Let's now all welcome Dr. Robert Bota.
Hello, my name is Robert Bota. I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry. I run an inpatient and a unit, a med-psych unit, and also I run the transcranial magnetic stimulation clinic here at UC Irvine. Today, I will discuss about the continuum of anxiety and its functions in the day-to-day life, what it means to have too little anxiety or too much anxiety, when anxiety becomes diagnosed as a psychiatric illness. Furthermore, I will address the role of stress, which can be good stress, also bad stress in our life. And finally, I will talk about ways to improve the brain health. Oh, the image is there. Initially, in order for one person to have a diagnosis of a mental illness, has to meet 3 main criteria. Those are symptoms, duration, and also functional impairment. Yes, this is a slide. All of those have to happen in the same time. And if at one point somebody is diagnosed with that, that can be remitted, and in between, the person brain will function just as if never had that condition, anxiety or depression, for example. However, it has been shown that having one episode of anxiety or depression over diagnosed would increase the likelihood that that can repeat. So therefore, there are certain things that we should look at and understand in order to prevent such events from happening. So in terms of symptoms, for simplicity, I like to divide them in three categories. The first category is the affect and moods. How do we feel and why do we feel like that? And in the next slide, I'm going to talk particularly about affect. The second category in the symptoms group, we are looking at how the brain thinks. How do we form associations? How fast do we respond to a query or of a situation? How do we respond to that? In the sense that what kind of defense ego mechanisms we use. We function on the lower ego defense mechanism, which have their utility, such as anger or denial, or on the higher defense mechanisms, such as planning or humor. Maura, if we can go 2 slides back.
Oh, sure.
And last of the symptoms is how do we behave? It is always a progression. First, we have some thoughts that we don't like, and then our thinking is affected by that in the sense that we are not thinking as fast, and at the end, our behavior may change in order to address and alleviate in a way or another the previous two categories of symptoms. Now we have a diagnostic and statistical manual that if you have those symptoms, you have to have them over a certain duration of time. Like, for example, in generalized anxiety disorder, you have to have 6 months. In major depressive disorder episode, you have to have those number of symptoms required for 2 weeks, and so on. However, I can have myself a symptom or two of depression, for example, or anxiety, say that I didn't sleep well, I am tired, my energy is low, and I feel guilty that I didn't spend more time with my kid yesterday. But if I don't meet the duration of time, that does not go to the third part. And even if I meet the duration of time and my functionality is not impaired, then again, the criteria for diagnosis are not met. Maura, if you can go to the next slide, please. Affect, it's something that we are born with. There are many kinds of affects, 5 negative, 2 positive, and 1 neutral. But what is it affect? We are pretty much born with it. You can see that on baby. When they are happy, they laugh. When they don't like the food that you give them, they grimace in disgust. If they get scared, then they cry, and all of those affective responses are innate. We are born with them. They come with the emotional component and also with a facial characteristic facial representation of that particular affect. So if we can go to the next slide to illustrate, the negative affects are the dismal, which would be the avoidance signal, the disgust, which is the need to expel, the shame and humiliation. Shame is the lesser end and humiliation is the higher end of that affect, which is the self-protection signal. We feel that something is, we are discovered as being fraud or being bad, so we react in different ways. Either we attack other or attack self, or we avoid the situations. Fear and terror, which is the signal to flee and freeze, anger and rage, the demand to fix the situation in a way or another, distress and anguish, the cry for help. The surprise and startle, it's pretty much the reset button. And from there, the affect can go one way or the other. And the good affects are enjoyment and joy, which is the social bond, interest, excitement, the pull toward mastery, ready to do the homework and accomplish the next goals. If we go to the next slide, just for a little explanation, a feeling is when we realize that we have that particular affect. As affect happen simultaneously as a result of stimuli, we have an affect as a result of it. However, that part of the equation is totally unconscious. The next thing is called response, SAR, so stimulus affect response, and the response is going to be tailored on how we know to deal with certain situations, how we learn to deal with them, and what do they make of that particular intervention. For example, if at work is a situation that the boss is presenting information that you feel that is unfair and not right, you might have like anger or disgust or so on affect as response, but then the scripts of our brain would kick in and we'll decide how we need to behave as response to that situation in order to solve it with certain benefit for us or for the interaction that happened. Those scripts, how we behave in certain situations as at work, with friends, with significant other, with children, all of those scripts that we develop over the year make up our own personality, how we are as a person, what kind of software we use. Let's go to the next slide. Sullivan Tompkins, a very known psychologist, in 70s studied babies, looking at their affects, the responses, and the drives that pretty much make us kind of lead our life. And he realized that we all attempt to maximize the positive affects, to feel better, to reduce the negative affects, and pretty much anything that helps the performance of those roles is good for human life. Anything that interferes with that is bad for us. My mentor, Walter Ricci, used to say, whatever does not increase your pride increases your shame. And in a way, even though it's oversimplified, it ends up like that. So if we go to the next slide to see how that would apply here. Why do we have anxiety? In the sense, what is anxiety? Why, if we are we have scripts to increase what feels good and decrease what feels as bad, we get anxiety to certain degrees. And actually, one does not contradict the other. If one has panic disorder and they are afraid that if they go to the mall and have another panic attack, would make them quite uncomfortable and maybe feeling ashamed and so on, staying in the house and avoiding that situation could in a way fit with Tompkins' blueprint. So what is anxiety? Anxiety is a psychological, physiological, and behavioral state induced by a threat to well-being. The threat to well-being, of course, can be actual or potential. You know, can be a tiger there in the mall, and it happened a few times, as I saw on the news, or it is something that we think that will happen. So what's the difference between our responses? So if we go to the next slide, maybe the one before. Oh, I removed that one. Okay. So what kind of symptoms we have as a result of anxiety? Anxiety comes with mind symptoms, which are racing thoughts, excessive worries. In panic disorder, people feel like losing control over the mind, which is an extremely scary phenomenon, even though nobody went crazy because of that, but you feel losing control, and all of us, we pride the fact that we can navigate life, we can go to work, we can do shopping, we can call friends, but feeling like losing that capability, the ability to think, is scary, and sometimes you end up even thinking you're going to die, and you really believe it at that time. It gets to you with a clarity and painful feeling that at that moment, if you ever been near a person having a panic attack, doesn't matter what you say, it's not going to get better immediately. So it's kind of good to stay near them, just show support, and eventually, slow by slow, they will realize that, and they're going to come out of that panic attack. Physical symptoms, they are driven often pretty much all the time by sympathetic responses, which is a stress response, and it can happen from any level. Shaking, sweating, tingling, numbness, nausea, dizziness, butterfly in the stomach, fast heart rate, pretty much all of those. Each of us will have a pattern of how we respond to an anxiety situation. It's going to get to us in one way or another, and it might be different from you and I. When somebody's cutting in front of your car very short on the freeway, and all of a sudden you wake up even though you were relaxed before, and your heart is beating fast, and you have the acuity of the situation, and you are scared. But we can learn those responses, and I'll discuss as of why. Can we go to the next slide? All right. So in regard to anxiety responses that I mentioned earlier, we have the sympathetic responses, which are the physical symptoms that I mentioned, the mind symptoms that we discussed earlier, and eventually the behavioral responses to anxiety. We learn what is threatening for us. We try to put it together and try to minimize the discomfort that that is creating, and oftentimes that will lead to certain behavioral implication of such that would help us minimize the painful situation, even though it's not necessarily adaptive for us. Maura, can you go to the next slide, please? We skip on? Okay. Yes, next one. So in order to study acute stress, and then I'll talk about chronic stress, research is designed different, very simple kind of intervention, checking the stress hormones like cortisol. And in the first experiment, the Norway Army training for parachuting training, the researchers chose a number of soldiers, young soldiers, and the first test, in order to learn how to parachute, they were jumping from a 12-meter, about 40 feet high, and they measured before and after the cortisol. They measured their performance. They measured how did they do, how did they feel about it. And in time, anxiety decreased and performance increased overall. And another study the researcher looked at 20 people that gave 5 speeches, public speeches. Overall, the steroid level of the fifth speech compared with the first one decreased, meaning the anxiety of those people decreased in time. However, when they look closer to the data, they were able to differentiate two kinds of responses in those people. A group of people have the very high stress response at the beginning, decreasing a little bit during the speech, and that maintained overall for all the 5 public speaking engagements, as the other group have a stress response that was higher at the beginning, but in time with exposure, they got used to it and got better. Next slide, please. In terms of neuronal circuitry, the brain uses approximately the same circuits for many of the anxiety disorders. However, as the acute response, if we perceive a dangerous stimuli, the thalamus will send a very quick and dirty signal to the amygdala for immediate response. That response, it is not conscious. We don't even realize at the time that we respond to that. Stepping on a branch at night, thinking that it's a snake, we jump back, and in the meantime, that signal traveled to the processing areas, occipital lobe, and we realize that actually it's not a threat, and we say, okay, it's fine. But that is a very useful stimuli, so we respond very quickly in order to avoid a dangerous situation. Now, if that amygdala is destroyed by stroke or other reasons, or in an experiment, they remove the amygdala on monkeys, they become more calm, docile. They have hard time understanding fear and learning fear. And even though monkeys have an innate fear of snakes, a monkey got bitten by the snake, and the second time, that monkey tried to approach the snake again without fear. So amygdala is very essential to learning fear responses. They also got hypersexual and tendency to self-soothe, putting object in their mouth. Now, the chronic stress will increase the neurogenesis, will bring more neurons, is going to create more synapses in the amygdala, which would lead to the fact that even lesser stressors would elicit a fear response. Now, that is different than in the rest of the brain that I'm going to talk later, where, especially in the executive parts of the brain, like prefrontal or frontal cortex, the neurogenesis will decrease, meaning the activity in that part of the brain will decrease, so therefore less executive control over the emotional part of the brain. Let's go to the next slide. So, excuse me, other part of neuronal circuitry is the prefrontal cortex that I mentioned earlier, that neurogenesis and plasticity there decreases. However, it can be improved with certain techniques that I'm going to talk later. Pretty much emotions that we have, if they are one of the negative affects that, and we have them for a longer time, eventually it's going to make changes in our thinking pattern. We start thinking, what do they mean? What do I need to do in order to change them? What is going on there? And eventually we're going to create some meanings and eventually beliefs that we are in a way defective. A second. My computer just turned off. All right. So we, in a way, create some meanings that in a way we are not as we thought we are. So eventually behavior would follow, as if we think bad of ourselves, we're going to start avoiding, we're going to decline invitation to meet with friends, or have issues in terms of functionality, which in turn is going to make the emotions even more prominent on the negative side, and the circle will continue. Cognitive behavioral therapy will help with that, as well as many other therapies that I'm going to mention in the next slides. Another important part in anxiety is hippocampus, and it has been shown in twin studies that people that go to a twin that go to war and twin that doesn't go to war, if the hippocampal volume is lower than normal, they'll have higher likelihood, higher odds to develop anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's move on to the next slide. So there are many kinds of anxiety. I just like this picture, but there are a few other kinds, like for example, generalized anxiety disorder, when people have excessive worries that are more than what the situation will require, that will last 6 months or more. Simple phobia is a very common condition. In general, if I ask my residents, my students, who is afraid of public speaking, heights, snakes, fear of blood? Well, not that much, as in medicine field, they kind of have to. And we may have that, but it's not necessarily that it's going to cause an impairment of all of us. Personally, I'm afraid of snakes, and as long as I keep away from zoo, I'm fine, or some trails going on the mountain. But what if I would be a veterinarian and somebody would bring a 70 pounds python on my table and said, you know, Fluffy has a cough? It would be problematic for me. So other anxiety disorder is panic disorder. In panic disorder, people have at least few panic attacks, one of which being out of the blue. It can happen at night, can happen anytime in the day. The intensity of anxiety increases over minutes, reaches a peak, stays there for 20, 30 minutes, and then decreases. When the brain uses so much energy during a panic attack, it's like running your car 7,000 RPM and going 2 miles an hour, or just staying in the parking lot, will use a lot of gas. After that, people report that they feel tired, exhausted, and overall quite distraught. There are mixed anxiety and depression conditions. Oftentimes you don't know which one is first, but in general, if people are depressed, eventually they worry how long would that last, how much is going to impair their functionality, and the other way around. Social phobia, it's quite common, can be overcome with either medication intervention or therapeutic intervention, talk therapy. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of vulnerabilities, we all behave different stressors. Certain stressors, even if they appear big to others, for us may not be as impactful, and the other way around. Resilience is dependent both on environmental and genetic factors. And if the resilience is decreased, mild stressor may lead to serious impairments. Oftentimes, this is not what we will describe for our entire life. Resilience varies depending on how you're doing, what other things are going on in your life, how many good things, how many bad things you have. Even being diagnosed with cancer doesn't mean that you're going to develop depression or anxiety if there are many other good things going on in your life, even if genetics would not be necessarily on your part. those we call good stressors and bad stressors. And to exemplify just for a moment, just for us to understand how practically to look at this, is something called decreased tolerance to normal stressors. Even though that is not a symptom, like one of the things counting toward an illness, we can look at it as a measure, like a sign when our mind energy is decreasing and we have less and less resources to deal with normal stressors around us. Like, for example, if my kid spills the milk on the table, I can be, Andrew, I told you to be careful, versus, come on, Andrew, be more careful next time, let's clean it together. So normal stressors can bring different responses. When we see that we respond excessively to a situation that otherwise would be normal, at least for me, it's time to think that some other good things should be in our life. We should eat better. We should do a few things that would increase our resilience from the environmental sense. As genes, fortunately, so far, we are not very lucky of changing, and in any way is a polygenic sort of representation and factors. So let's go to the next slide. About 30% of people that do have psychiatric diagnosis may have some substance use disorder. It is important from a pragmatic standpoint to differentiate and see what's happening, what's first, because the treatment sometimes would differ. For example, if the symptoms are before and the substance use appears later, that would suggest that sort of presentation, versus if the symptom persisting or not persisting 1 month after the substance situation is removed. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's too little stress? Most of us function in the 70 percentile, where we have optimum stress or too much stress, somewhat too much. But when we have too little stress, that can be a problem as well. Recently, I treated a patient on tenure track. The tenure was due, like the application was due like in about a year. She needed to publish a few more publications, didn't prepare the other thing. It's like, I know that I'm going to lose that. I'm going to have to start again, but I don't feel stressed at all. You know, it's like just no anxiety there. It's like, however, if we pass the optimum stress level, we start feeling tired, and the tiredness will become a pattern, you know, from one day to another to the next day, and then we'll start feeling exhausted, and not only exhaustion due to lack of sleep, which is easily quantifiable. If you are tired like 10 in the morning, you have 10 hours of sleep. That if you are tired between 5 to 7 in the evening, maybe even 20 hours or more of sleep that. So you notice the exhaustion, that is a draining feeling. You're still functioning okay, but the functioning starts deteriorating over days or weeks. Eventually, if that continues, we start noticing decreasing functionality. We start worrying what's going on, where it's going to go. Things are piling up. It's going to be very difficult to kind of recover from that. And then it becomes the catch-22. The more things that you have behind, the more things you want to do every single day. And at the end of the day, of course, you weren't able to do them because you are not at your baseline. And then you beat yourself even more on that. And instead of implementing logical approaches, like, for example, take 1 or 2 tasks, finish them, move to the next one, have reasonable expectation, we push ourselves to the point that we really reach burnout. We breakdown as functionality in that regard. Next slide. So there are many biological findings, but the interesting aspect to me as a scientist, I find it fascinating, is if you have cancer or a medical illness, certain things happen in the body that resemble the things that happen if you have social stressors or if you have psychological processes stressors. Like if you develop depression, pretty much you're going to have decrease in plasticity of the brain, decrease in certain neurotropin, such as brain-derived neurotropic factor. If you have certain life events, social isolation, socioeconomic burden, those things will happen the same. With medical problem, those things will happen the same. So it is a very clear association between what happened around us, what happened in our mind, and what happened in our body. Now, if those things happen, our what's called brain plasticity, our ability to adapt to what's going on around us decreases. It's like when you have a stress response, and that stress response would create the brain to function in certain ways. I would imagine to do complex calculus while running from a tiger versus when you are in your office. So those things kind of go together, and they are immediate and chronic responses. But I'm going to go over how we can improve the brain plasticity and our ability to respond to stressors and life in the next slide. So to increase the brain-derived neurotropic factor, there are a number of things that are very well proven. One of them, antidepressant medication, will increase the brain-derived neurotropic factor, and in turn will increase the activity in the smart brain. Light therapy, which even though here in California, I don't see it as often as I've seen the seasonal affective disorders in Kansas City, for example, that will increase the brain-derived neurotropic factor, 30 minutes in the morning, 10,000 lux. Other way to increase the brain-derived neurotropic factor is using transcranial magnetic stimulation, and that's one of my students demonstrating to the other residents how to identify the individual motor threshold. I don't see fish oil on this slide, but fish oil with omega-3 will increase the brain-derived neurotropic factor. Fasting, especially intermittent fasting, to have all your meals within 8-hour period in a day. So if you eat at 10, the next meal should be the last meal of the day should be at 6. For some people, it's quite difficult to do that. And exercise. Exercise deserves special attention. It is nothing as exercise in improving the brain-derived neurotropic factor. Even in dementia processes such as Alzheimer, that's the only thing that shows by far a clear improvement in those symptoms. Let's go to the next slide. So, apologize. In terms of treatment, what kind of therapies are used to treat anxiety disorders? In psychiatry, we're lucky. We have over 1,000 kinds of therapies. Only one, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been proven to be better than the other to some degrees. Otherwise, all the others are equal as improving the brain health. In phobias, exposure or social anxiety, exposure is a great way to go. For example, for my fear of snakes, if I would be a veterinarian, I would go to a therapist. They'll show me like a fluffy little cartoonish like looking snake. I'll look at that until I'll feel comfortable. Then they're gonna give me like a picture that resembles closer a snake. Then it's gonna, show me a realistic picture of a snake until I get comfortable with that. And then they make me touch snakes or so on. So eventually, exposure therapy works. There are many other ways of treating that. Cognitive behavioral therapy is looking at cognitive distortions. What do we think? What do we think that way? So at the end, we learn to understand our reactions and modify them. Mindfulness got more notoriety in the last 10 years. It's an excellent tool, somehow overrated, but very, very successful in helping anxiety. Typically, mindfulness therapy is done in groups of 8 or 10 people. They have 1 or 2 therapists. Allows your brain to incorporate all the other stimuli from the outside, look peacefully at them. So for many people that is very helpful. And as for the next slide.
Dr. Bota, it's Maura. Can I just step in here for just a moment? We have about 8-9 minutes left, and we did get a number of questions. So
all right, I'll be done in 2 minutes, Maura. Okay. Would that be okay?
Perfect.
All right, 2 minutes, perfect. All right. So this should be kind of the last slide. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few medication intervention. We use antidepressant medication, and in principle, what they do pertinent to anxiety, decrease the amount of destruction of serotonin, especially in the prefrontal and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, by inhibiting the picking up and reuptaking and destroying the serotonin. They inhibit that mechanism. So in turn, the brain has more serotonin available in order to increase the activity in the smart brain. Benzodiazepines are often used for a short period of time, hopefully, but sometimes for even longer periods of time. What they do, they increase the activity of what's called GABA, and that is an inhibitory system of the mind, and there are 2 kinds, GABA A and GABA B. Beta blocker, very important medication, especially in social phobias. Versatile medication used by the primary doctors as a weak blood pressure medication, by neurologists as migraine prevention. We psychiatrists use it to decrease the sympathetic response, meaning when people have to speak in public or play piano, they won't shake, voice won't tremble, they wouldn't sweat. So pretty much it decreases the amount of physical symptoms of anxiety. Anticonvulsants maybe in panic disorders like valproic acid, so on. And in conclusion, what I'm teaching my patients, my students, and my residents, know your anxiety response, know when you become overwhelmed, know what you can do to control that and get in control again, and as much as we can to increase the good stress, to increase the things that would give us a better plasticity of the brain, that will increase our BDNF, do the exercise, take the fish oil. If there are problems in the winter months, use the light therapy, and live well and eat well and enjoy friends and bring as many good things in your life, because your resilience would be better. And thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me go back and pose some of the questions that were entered into the chat. And by the way, I just want to say how your explanation of Fluffy, the 70-foot boa constrictor with the cough, was very funny.
That's my problem. Okay, I'm not going to zoo though.
That's right. Okay, let's see. Someone asked about Of course, thank you. They thank you so much for talking about ways that an individual can reduce their stress and anxiety. But any recommendations in helping others, like coworkers or family, if you see them all stressed out?
Oh yeah, it happens a lot, especially say at work. Uh, I'm running this unit and I have nurses, social workers, and there are different, kind of patients. Some of them may have many symptoms of what we call borderline personality disorder, and one of the ego defense mechanisms that they overutilize is splitting, meaning that talks to some people that you are the best nurse and you are the worst nurse, and there's tension that happens there. I always have to kind of keep my radar up and see when they start being more stressed, when they start getting disappointed of what they do, when they start feeling taken advantage of. And all of those are easily observed. You know, they are more stressed, they tell you more, they complain more about a situation or another. You see them splitting in different, and the quick solving is to understand them, to see how you can help, to show them that I can do something and I will do something to address the situation and improve the patient care, and also improve their ability to do their job by not being so stressed. Sometimes we just get some food and talk over a pizza at work. Um, at home with the children, you know, they are bound to. People want to be heard. That, I think, in one word, would be kind of the easiest intervention. They want to be heard non-judgmental. They want to be heard sometime without being given uh, what to do. Do this and do that, and then you're gonna be fine. Because sometimes may feel that is condescending. But we need the mirroring. We need to hear that we matter. We need to hear that we exist and we play some part in somebody's life, that we belong. And that intervention on its own would be excellent. We all need to have what we call self-objects. You know, when we have a state of need, whom do we call? What do we do in order to decrease that anguish?
Beautiful, beautiful response. Thank you. We have another question. This individual says, I work with K through 12 school district leaders. What are the key points that the school leaders might keep in mind while supporting the mental health and well-being of young people, particularly high school students and young adults?
It has to be a line of communication. I know through my kids, and one of my colleagues is a psychiatrist, is going to schools and teaching, about burnout and what the teachers, the students, their colleagues, and their families should look for. It is a highly competitive environment now. I see my kids, they are stressed, and I'm trying to de-stress them, tell them, don't have to get all of that, and you don't have to get 10 extracurricular activity and flagpole and dance and all of the others in order to get to whatever Harvard or so. But more and more I see that medical students that apply, they have a CV bigger than mine. It's that urgency and that fear that somehow they're going to be left behind, that the environment creates a lot of stress. Parents play a role in it. I don't know how long it's going to go, but I think it's getting to the point of being an emergency situation. In my kids' school, they have a couple of kids that committed suicide, and nobody noticed that. Yeah, they do have the counselors and so on, but to what degree, where's the threshold, where's the resilience, what's going on in their life that you can accurately direct your intervention to those that need. So there should be a sort of quantification in the sense how you're doing in your life, what other things you're doing. You're doing homework until midnight and then you're sleeping and going to school and you don't have the exercise, you don't have the friends, you don't have the other thing. How much the internet, Facebook, and all of the other things, how much you compare with your colleagues and how much you try to show in order to improve your pride. As I was saying earlier, with whatever doesn't increase your pride increases your shame. So I think it's a multifaceted question, absolutely awesome question, but I don't know how to answer to it in few minutes.
Well, I think you did a great service to the question just now. I have another question from an individual who says, in general, people with brain health issues don't feel like they are understood. Is there a public health campaign being developed to help others get a basic understanding of what we go through?
Oh, they are. They are. NAMI has a family section. There are many organizations that look into that, including organizations that don't look necessarily at the mental health, like Canon Foundation here in Southern California that's looking at well-being of family of people that are diagnosed with different cancers. Because that's an issue too. That's a lot of stress on those people too. They don't know how to navigate symptoms. They don't know if they can show that they are sad or in despair and so on, because they think that they will let down the significant other that's been just diagnosed. So it's there are many efforts and they are more visible, and I think there's a lot of interest in that. For example, at UC Irvine, with another faculty member that been through the situation of having the significant other diagnosed with cancer and had no idea what to do during that time, feeling lost and all of those, decided that to start a group that would serve the significant others of people diagnosed with cancer at UCI, which I find it's needed. So there are a lot of groups and efforts. There are many others that are surfacing now. I think the awareness is more and more. I think we are more comfortable with our feeling, and we don't have to create a stoic position on which we are tough and we don't want to think of how we feel. But this is where everything starts, and we all have those affects as we were born with them. They exist.
Yes. Dr. Bota, we have just 2 minutes left, and I have a little outro to provide to our audience, but I have just one quick question, wondering if, I don't want to pressure you for time, but if it's something you could answer quickly.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on using marijuana to alleviate depressive symptoms?
Well, that's going to be a difficult question for me, and I disclose that I'm biased. Since marijuana got legal in California, on my inpatient unit, I got like way and way more students with psychosis induced by marijuana. Parents would bring their kids from New York, from Berkeley, from Stanford. And I've been doing this job for a long time. Never been as bad as now. We know that some people have no problem. Some people would benefit from it. But I believe that especially in young brains, don't do that. We know very little about it. We know very little about immediate implication of it. We know very little of but what we know for sure, if one develops psychosis while smoking marijuana, due to marijuana, they have 50% chance to develop schizophrenia in 3 years or bipolar 1 in 5 years. Good research, very clear data. So I'm recognizing my bias, but those are the data that I want to answer with.
That's great. Thank you very much. I will go ahead and begin our outro as we are basically at time. So again, I just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us and for your interest in this topic and your willingness to learn. Just want to remind so faculty and staff, you have individual behavioral health benefits. You can find out all about your benefits through your medical plan, and that information is posted on UCNet. Simply search on the keyword behavioral health. At many of our campuses as well, there are on-site EAP, which means Employee Assistance Program offices, where you have counselors that you could speak with face-to-face. And students, if you're listening, you also have behavioral health coverage through your student health plan, and you visit the student health plan website for more information. And again, just reminding everyone, the recording link will be available very shortly on the Stigma-Free UC page, which is part of UCNet, which is also under the heading of the system-wide well-being. So please share the link broadly with your colleagues, friends, and family. And on a final note, this presentation concludes our 2018-2019 Stigma-Free UC initiative. And I want to sincerely thank you, Dr. Bota, and all of our presenters for sharing their knowledge and their expertise, because without you, this series would not have been possible. You all made it so great. And to those who attended, thank you so much for your interest. Please apply what you've learned here with your colleagues, friends, and family. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Maura.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and end the webinar. And until next time, thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.